Hi, everyone. I'm Mola Lengi. Welcome back to CBSN. It is day 4 of the Derek Chauvin trial. Already, we've seen strong testimony detailing the arrest that led to George Floyd's death. The former police officer may be the one standing trial in the courtroom, but what many call systemic racism within the American policing and judicial system also seems to be standing trial in the court of public opinion. That injustice is the focus of an op-ed on BET.com entitled "A Guilty Verdict for Derek Chauvin is the Only Justice Acceptable for George Floyd." For more, I want to bring in the author of that article, Nekima Levy Armstrong. She's a civil rights lawyer and the former president of Minnesota's NAACP chapter. Nekima, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start with the testimonies of the witnesses for the prosecution that we've heard today. There have been some very strong accounts of what people saw on May 25th of last year. Whose testimony has stuck out to you most and why?
Well, the testimony of Darnella Frazier really had an impact on me, seeing that she was only 17 years old at the time that she recorded the video of George Floyd's arrest and subsequent murder that was seen around the world. To think that a young person would have the thought of mind to walk back to the scene and to start recording, it's just amazing. And just her courage and strength on the stand was really remarkable in light of the magnitude of this trial against Derek Chauvin and the impacts to George Floyd, to our community, and to his family as well. Additionally, I was impressed by Donald Williams, who is a young African-American man who has a background as an MMA fighter, and he was one of the most vocal bystanders trying to pressure the police to remove Derek Chauvin's knee off of George Floyd's neck. And his testimony was really riveting. He stood strong in spite of the defense attorney's attempt to rattle him on the stand. One of the other testimonies that we're talking about here in the Twin Cities was that of Genevieve Hansen. She is the Minneapolis firefighter who did her best to intervene and to attempt to provide medical care for George Floyd and to pressure the police to check his pulse.
You stated in your op-ed that Chauvin is symbolic of the racial hatred and white supremacy that is inherent in police departments. Can you explain that?
Absolutely. It's no secret that many police departments around the country have been infiltrated by people connected to white supremacist groups and the Ku Klux Klan, according to the FBI's own research. And yet, for some reason, we tend to forget that information, that there are actually people who hate Black people, who hate other people of color, who are present and working inside of police departments. Now, whether Derek Chauvin has a direct connection to any of those groups at the end of the day does not matter as much as his conduct on the streets and his encounters with people of color, and the fact that he engaged in brutalization of people of color over his more than 2 decades of experience at the Minneapolis Police Department. He was involved in a number of encounters. He also was a part of the killing of a Native man named Wayne Reyes. And according to a recent New York Times article, he tried a similar technique that he used on George Floyd when encountering a Black woman who had a dispute in her family's home. And so Derek Chauvin's conduct overall, from my perspective, indicates racism and white supremacy and a disdain for Black people living in the community in which he patrolled. And we all saw what happened to George Floyd. The fact that once Derek Chauvin came on the scene, it escalated matters to a whole other level. Derek Chauvin had a reckless disregard for the harm that he was causing to George Floyd. And he even seemed to take joy in being able to press his knee into George Floyd's neck for as long as he did. And as the bystanders pleaded with Derek Chauvin to remove his knee, he seemed to press his knee in even harder and even bounced on George Floyd's neck as well. And the look that he had on his face with his hands in his pocket just really seem diabolical and indicative of the racial hatred and anti-Blackness that is at the root of the problem in the Minneapolis Police Department, as well as police departments around the country.
Nekima, I know we're potentially weeks away from any sort of verdict, but what would a guilty verdict mean to the Black community in Minneapolis as well as around the country versus what an acquittal would potentially mean? Take us down those two possible routes.
Well, at this point, we are expecting a guilty verdict in this case, although we know that history has not stood on our side as far as even when there is video evidence of a police killing and a person is unarmed, that does not automatically result in a guilty verdict. Most of the time, the officer in question is acquitted. So we understand that history. But one other relevant aspect to why a guilty verdict is important is the fact that in the state of Minnesota, we have never had a white officer charged and, of course, never convicted for killing a Black person. So Derek Chauvin would be the first white officer held accountable for killing a Black person in the history of the state of Minnesota. Now, many Black people have been killed at the hands of white officers, but not a single one of those officers was held accountable. Most of them were not even fired, and many of them are still on the job to this day, patrolling the streets of our communities of color.
Do you think,
in terms of,
I'm sorry, go ahead. No, finish your thought.
In terms of whether there is acquittal, I believe that all hell will break loose. I grew up in Los Angeles around the time in which Rodney King was beaten by the police there. And, the trial was moved to Simi Valley, a retired police community. There was an acquittal and all hell broke loose in Los Angeles. I would hate to see that happen once again in the city of Minneapolis, but tensions are high. People are frustrated and they're at the end of their ropes in terms of seeing how the system fails Black people time and time and time again. And so I hope that justice is served in this particular case and that the jury takes seriously the contents of that video and the eyewitness testimony.
Do you see parallels between this case, the George Floyd killing, the trial, and the Rodney King incident and trial?
I absolutely see parallels. I mean, if you think back to the beating of Rodney King, the only reason that the world knows about that beating is because of a bystander video, a grainy bystander video that showed all of the kicks and blows that Rodney King sustained at the hands of multiple officers. In that situation, officers claimed that Rodney King had drugs in his system, that they could not restrain him, and so they kept escalating force as a result. And what many of us call that excuse is a focus on the big Black man and saying that, this big Black man is uncontrollable, we fear him, and so we have to escalate the level of violence and force that we use in that situation. And in this particular case, we know that George Floyd was also a big Black man. He was very tall, and he was very strong. And of course, the defense attorneys are attempting to blame George Floyd for his own death by talking about the drugs in his system and things like that. And Derek Chauvin made clear to a bystander who testified yesterday, Charles McMillan, that George Floyd was a big guy, that he had drugs in his system, and that he had to find a way to restrain him, which I think is absolutely despicable. I mean, we all saw the man pleading for his life. The fact that he wasn't resisting, he was just trying to breathe, begging officers to breathe, begging officers to allow him to even move to the front seat of the squad car. So he was willing to go, but he let them know, I'm claustrophobic. I've been in a situation like this before. I can't breathe. I don't want to die. They refused to listen. They did not care. They showed a blatant disregard for human life and how they treated George Floyd. And at the end of the day, people need to be reminded that all of this started over an alleged counterfeit $20 bill. George Floyd's life was worth way more than that. And the system had no business using deadly force over a $20 bill.
Nekima Levy Armstrong, thank you.
Thank you for having me.